Here's Gough Whitlam.
Until I went to university, I didn't do much sport at all. And then, of course, I did one which a lot of people were doing for the first time. Very good political training. I took up rowing. It's good political training because you can look one way while going the other.
Were you a shy boy or a gregarious boy?
I probably was shy. I had to become familiar with student politics, of course, when I was in residence at Sydney University, parents in Canberra.
You're getting ahead of me. I want to stay with the school years for a while. When we last talked, you were so fascinated with Greek and Latin and language. How did that all start? When did you start getting interested in all of that?
Oh, well, of course, my father used to give us books of, Kingsley's heroes, about the Theseus and Perseus and so on, those male chauvinist fellas. And then, of course, we did Norse legends, Thor, Odin, Freya, all that sort of stuff. So I was a bookish boy, that because my father always had a very good library. But my mother was rather more gregarious than my father and had a very good sense of humour, a somewhat caustic one at times. They were very good parents.
And you obviously did Latin at school, at senior school?
Yes, I did. And of course, I didn't have, as you do in state schools, you start, geometry and algebra and trigonometry and so on, and in the same year that you start French or German or Latin or Greek. So I was always backward in mathematics until I went into the Air Force, and of course they tended to put people with a university degree into make them navigators, and I ended up as the navigator of the only Empire aircraft at MacArthur's headquarters. But of course, navigation depended on trigonometry. So when I saw the point of mathematics, I was good at it.
You still, to this day, I'm told by Barry Cohen, take a note of a log of every flight you go on.
Oh yes, I've done that. And of course, when I was Prime Minister, after I was sacked, Jim Killen, who was Minister for Defence, he calculated my logbooks for the period that I was Prime Minister.
Do you still do it?
Oh yes, I still keep it up. Yes, it's the only diary I really keep. I keep copies of all the speeches I've made, but I always keep up my flights. I know whenever I've been in an aeroplane or a helicopter, I know where it was, how long the flight was, what type of aircraft it was, and because, as you know, aircraft all have different identification numbers according to their nationality, so I can always tell where the aircraft came from. So I know wherever I've been, and if I made a speech, what I've said pretty well any time in the last 60 years.
When did you become politicised? When did you become interested in politics?
During the war, because we were at 2 Aboriginal settlements. The great advantage that I had at Cooktown and then at Gough, Melville Bay, Yirrkala, was that when I entered Parliament, I knew more about the way Aborigines were treated at Yirrkala or the way they'd been dispossessed as being sent down from Cooktown to Rockhampton, where hundreds died of flu. When we were at Cooktown, Curtin had a referendum to give the federal parliament the same wartime powers as it had until 5 years after the end of hostilities. That was supported by both sides in the federal parliament. And then, of course, it was stymied because in Tasmania they would not refer powers to the federal parliament. So then, of course, there had to be a referendum. I canvassed for the success of that referendum because I was outraged that Menzies, who had just become the leader of the opposition again, he campaigned against the referendum. A very cynical act, and it disillusioned me with Menzies. So I thought, well, obviously when I get back into civilian life, I'll join the Labor Party. And I did as soon as I came back.
And when did you meet Margaret in that process?
You remember the Women's Weekly? There was a woman called Jackson who was the editor of it. And of course, she had a Christmas party at Rose Bay. And Margaret is very tall, of course, as you know. And across a crowded room, our eyes met, and some of her friends saw that we met. And of course, while I was in the Sydney University Regiment, I applied on the day of Pearl Harbor to join the Air Force, so just before the call-up, we were married. It's the longest political marriage in political history.
Can we fast forward a little bit? Did you ever think that you should have got in first and sacked Kerr once you realised what was happening?
No, it would be impossible to do it. I know he was preoccupied with this idea, but the whole thing is this. He had got me to ask the Queen to cancel the Dormant Commission for the Governor of Queensland, Hannah. And Hannah had abused my government. And he was the senior state governor. That is, when the Governor-General was away, then he would be the administrator. And Kerr rang me and said, well, I'm going away with Fancy Nancy to present her to the Queen, and Hannah would be the administrator. Clearly, after what he said yesterday, he couldn't be administrator. I think that the Queen should cancel his Dormant Commission. And I said, yes, I agree. And he said, well, would you send out the papers to me? And I did. And a couple of days later, Kerr rang me and said, I've been thinking over that. I think you should write to the Queen yourself. And I said, righto, will you send the papers back? And on the Monday, I think it was, I sent a courier to the Queen with her advice that she would cancel Hannah's Dormant Commission. And on Friday, we received the signal back from Buckingham Palace, from the Queen, that she agreed. And so it was cancelled. And then, of course, that's how, on Armistice Day, 30 years ago, Kerr rang Cutler, Sir Roden Cutler, VC. Kerr had never heard a shot fired in anger. He told Cutler that he was going to sack me at lunchtime and that if anything happened to him, then Cutler would have to take over. And Cutler said to him, it's in the book there, my impression is that Kerr acted from delusions of grandeur. On another occasion, Cutler said, I think Kerr intentionally meant to deceive Whitlam.
What that story indicates is that Kerr himself thought there was a chance that you might pick up the phone and try to get in first.
Well, I've just shown you can't ring up the phone. I mean, how could I use the phone? It was 2 o'clock in the morning.
2 o'clock in the morning, English time, you mean?
In English time. And I didn't know, as if I knew the Queen's number. That's absurd. And Kerr had never been in touch with her either, because about 5 o'clock that afternoon, after that great speech on the steps of Parliament, I did ring her private secretary in London. And of course he'd never heard about it. That is, Kerr had kept the Queen in the dark, the same as he kept me.
What are your memories of that day on the famous speech? It's your most famous speech in a way, isn't it?
It's the most famous speech ever delivered at the old Parliament House. And of course, then you remember there was a squeaky voice, followed by my voice, which at that time was very good.
Your voice saying?
You know, it was prophetic, you know, because the proclamation ended. John Kerr, Malcolm Fraser, God save the Queen. And I said, of course, that, well, may we say God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor-General. And it didn't. Because you remember, he went into exile with Fancy Nancy. What could be worse?
Gough Whitlam, thank you very much for joining us. There's Gough Whitlam on 702 Drive.